Please.
My name is Sofia Zurabiani, Georgian Broadcasting Company, IMEDI. So the question is, you mentioned about geopolitical catastrophe, the words of Putin. Do you think that Russia is trying to rebuild or regain the sphere of influence in the countries of former Soviet Union? Thank you.
If I understand your question correctly, you're talking about Russia rebuilding its influence in the so-called near abroad. Well, yes. I mean, the question is rather simple to answer. If only you would look, for example, to the Lithuanian president's impeachment process of a few years ago, in which Russian fingerprints were all over the place, and there's no secret there. And the tremendous influence that Russia has in the political processes of some of these neighboring states, Lithuania in particular, is both subtle and sometimes quite direct. I mean, in my view, there is overwhelming evidence of this. And now, what are the ultimate goals is another question. I don't think now that Lithuania and the Baltic countries are in NATO, there's any fear of direct military aggression. But the undermining of civil society, and some people say even the encouragement of certain extremist right-wing groups within the country, and so on. These are all efforts to weaken the soft power of the newly independent countries. Well, not so much newly now, but the independent states. So, and so there's I think the process is one of purposeful destabilization in a kind of a zero-sum game. That is, you don't want powerful neighbors. You want weak neighbors who can be manipulated. And I think that if you want a classic study of how that works, is you can look into the impeachment crisis of President Rolandas Paksas just a few years ago. So that would be something to study.
Yes, I mean, if in under the Soviet system you could destabilize the situation by mass deportations to Siberia and throughout the Soviet Union, you can't do that now. So what instead we see is passing out of Russian citizenship, huge financial investments in places like Crimea. I think I understand that the defense minister of Russia said that he received orders to make plans for the refurbishing of Sevastopol, not just the base, the city, but Crimea itself. So there are new methodologies for old strategies.
And we once again we see the disparity between what we in the opposition see as the Russian national interest and the ego of this regime. Look at the recent gas for Navy deal between Medvedev and Yanukovych, signed a couple of weeks ago. Effectively what they did is just for the purpose of symbolically keeping the Navy presence there, which is unless there's another conflict with Georgia plan, we can't conceivably see what it needs to be there for. But anyway, this gas for Navy deal means that the Russian government now, at the time of a great crisis, rising unemployment, falling GDP, falling industrial production, very, very serious economic difficulties in our country today, and will now be paying $4 billion a year, essentially, because of the gas subsidies to Ukraine, to keep this base. And I think this has got to be the world record, because if you go to second place, I think it's that, if my figures are right, I'm mainly going to double check them, but I think the United States pays something like $800 million a year for the Okinawa base in Japan, and I'm not talking about Guantanamo, which is something like $4,000, right? Yeah. But even some real figures, 800 million, I believe, is the annual dues for Okinawa. This is going to be $4 billion, just to maintain this kind of ego presence, in a neighboring country, for no apparent reason, for no real national security needs, and direct damage to the Russian economy, just to keep this pretense, that they have some, as President Medvedev put it, quote unquote, zone of privileged interests. That's what he referred to as the former Soviet states. And if Britain has the Commonwealth, for instance, where all the former, not all, but those who want to, former imperial colonies come in, it's a voluntary, mostly cultural now organization. Nobody blackmails anybody. Nobody puts, their bases. If your former colonies, if you treat your former colonies with respect, you'll get some respect back too. And this is what Britain has shown. And I'm afraid what our rulers are doing is the exact opposite. The only way what they're going to achieve is just create new enemies by doing what they're doing now.
If I could just add, it would be useful to compare the British interpretations now of their colonial history with Russian interpretation, or this government in Russia's interpretations of Tsarist and Soviet history. In other words, I remember, because I grew up in England, the benefits of British civilization, which is what was taught in the 50s and 60s amongst the colonial peoples. But that changed in the 70s and 80s when a lot of these ex-colonial peoples actually came to England and pointed out that it wasn't all beneficial necessarily, that there was such a thing as racism, discrimination, a very bad feeling, bigotry against the non-English people. And English history has progressed as a result. If you look at English textbooks, I think they're very fair in terms of what the English delivered and what they stifled. Is that the case in the case of Russian colonization, the Soviet colonization period? I would say no. So history, to me, history is not the past. History is ever present. And of course there are going to be different narratives from different angles, different national narratives and so on. But it's when narratives conflict to such a degree as either the interpretation of what was the Soviet Union, what was Stalin, where one side clearly sees it as something evil, I suppose you could call it, and the other side tries to defend it as something benign and civilizational, as beneficial. When the divergence is so great in the narrative, that's when I think it creates problems. It creates, at the very least, it could create suspicion that if the country cannot admit to its own history, admit to guilt, as Nina has pointed out, it cannot start a process of reconciliation. And there's the suspicion that there is an aim of continuity. If we weren't bad in the past doing this, if we do it again in the future or something similar, we also won't be bad. So, history is ever present. It cannot disappear. It's, and I'm just talking about the rituals that we're going to see in the next few days. It's what ordinary people think about their government and about their neighbours. And I don't think there will be this process of full reconciliation unless there's some closer, well, first of all, if the politicians get out of the business of interpreting history, that would be the best solution, but I'm sure they won't. But at least where there is some, like the Germans have done, for example, in terms of admission of what Nazi Germany did during the war, and I think they've been exemplary throughout the past few decades. And I'd love to see that same process, some courage and responsibility on the part of the Russian government vis-à-vis the past Soviet history.
And could I just add one quick thing, what I mentioned in the remarks to start with. The absurdity of it is that this process was begun. I mentioned President Yeltsin's recognition of the annexation of the Baltics, forcible annexation, his apology for Katyn. This all started, and now somehow we're supposed to think that these 10 years never happened in the 90s, and that this was all just made up, and now we're just going to jump back 20 years back and come and revisit all the Soviet lies that used to be put in the textbooks. This is just underscores the total absurdity. They just treat people for idiots, I guess. That's what it would seem like.
I think that I'm glad that you had that follow-up point, because my question was going to be, if such a reconciliation from the perspective of, for example, the Baltic states was not possible in the 90s, when Russia did make a number of gestures in that direction, why should we think that it might be possible in the future? I mean, from Russia's perspective, and I'm not saying that I share this point of view, Russia acknowledged many of the wrongs of the past, if not all of them, and then these neighboring states, rather than reconciling, joined the formerly hostile alliance. We can all debate the merits of that policy, but that certainly wasn't a reconciliatory step. And I guess the question is, to what extent is what you suggested possible, ever, if it wasn't possible then?
Well, in terms of hostile alliances, as I mentioned, many people in Russia think we should be in NATO too, so that there is no contradiction that our neighbors should be there as well. But in terms of the response, 4 years ago, just shortly before his death, former President Yeltsin was invited to Riga, to the Riga Castle, where he received the highest civilian award, the Order of the Three Stars of the Latvian Republic, as a recognition of his and the Russian democratically elected government's contribution to the liberation, the real liberation of the Baltic states in 1991. So I don't think it's true that there were no reciprocal steps. There have been.
I think you're right about this, but history doesn't stand still, and I think the Russian problem is that instead of moving forward, it actually tends to move back. I think you were talking about, we moved back 20 years and all of a sudden we gained the Soviet rhetoric, but, I would say we moved 400 years back because, as you know, there was a great attempt in 2007, 2008 to resurrect the Byzantium Empire, and all of a sudden, to really seriously celebrate 1612, which was basically Russian liberation from the Poles. The Poles again. So I think that is a big problem. Look at Turkey and Armenia. It's still no close to be reconciled, and yet there've been really serious strides done, and eventually it will happen. So my concern is that Russian attempts to move forward are scarce, and Russian attempts to move back is whoops in a sweep 600 years, which I find, in 2010 it's laughable, but hopefully eventually we'll get there.
Okay, thank you, Nina. I think we have just about run out of time, unless somebody has one last burning question, please.
So I don't know if it's a question I'd like comments on. When we have a discussion like this, there seems to me to be an awful lot of audiences, and it's not just the countries or people in this country from that region. It would seem to me that some of the most important people that should be listening and learning are in this city and in our academic institutions. If you grow up in the United States, at my age, unfortunately, there was no Ukraine, there was no Moldova. Russia and the Soviet Union were synonyms. You were taught that way. It was very messy when the Soviet Union broke up because, oh my God, cultures, languages, this is a messy. No wonder there was a chicken Kiev speech. Foggy Bottom and the White House didn't want to deal with this complicated thing. People in this country working on our foreign policy and our beliefs of what goes on in the world need to understand this history that was never taught.
Okay, on that note, unless Nadia want to say the last word, other than goodbye and saying goodbye, I'd like to thank our panelists for a wonderful job, and thank you all for coming and staying. See you next year.